Okay, Kevin. So we've the first two parts we talked about how you got to where you were, but your unique selling point was working out which stats from the past could and could not tell us what happened in the future. So can you tell people at home who want to win like you, which ones do and which ones don't?
I try to give you a couple
I don't want all your secrets, but you know, most of them.
no. I try to give you a couple of examples, maybe one either way. One stat that doesn't mean nearly as much as everybody thinks it does is total goals, for example, in football. In a football match, the biggest influence on how many goals there are going to be, there are two things really. The first is the difference in ability between the teams. The greater the difference in ability between two teams, the more goals you're likely to get. And the other factor is the importance of the occasion. The more important the occasion, the fewer goals you tend to get. But what everybody tends to latch onto is how many goals in the past have there been in this team's games and that team's games. And say, I mean, just to give you an example. So say you had two teams who are going to play each other, and in the past, this team's games have averaged 3 goals, and that team's games have averaged 3 goals. But both of them are the sort of teams where you would expect normally, those sort of teams, they would average maybe 2.5 goals, you know. So how many goals are there going to be when these teams play each other? And a lot of people would look at those numbers and say, wow, well, they're both above the average. So it's certainly going to be above the average, and maybe they sort of add together, and it's maybe we should be expecting more than 3 goals in this game. And there'll be other people who say, no, but we should be expecting at least 3 goals in this game. And my belief is that in that sort of game, actually your expectation is lower than 3. It's more than 2.5, but it's not 2.5, but it might be just 2.6 or 2.7. And the reason I come to that conclusion is just simply looking over long periods of time at lots of data. What happens when you get this sort of situation? And the reality is, in terms of total goals, if there's anything unusual in somebody's pattern, it doesn't really tell you very much about what's going to happen afterwards, you know. And I used to find that sort of thing so often, really, as I got more and more deeply into this job, that if I had any sort of, if I was known for anything at all, I was known as some sort of stats guy. But really, if people looked at what I was doing, a lot of the time they think, well, actually, he's betting against the stats. You know, in that sort of example that I've just been talking about, in that game, if I had any tip at all, it certainly wouldn't be high. It would tend to be low. You know, all the stats were pointing high, but I was saying they don't really mean as much as you think they do. In this sort of game, actually, it's best to go the other way. And that's what I would find so many times. All the stats seem to be pointing in one direction, but actually my tip would be going in the other direction, because I would be saying these things don't carry on to the same extent that everybody seems to think that they do, you know. So that's one example, or some examples of things that don't mean very much. One example that in later years I used to pay great attention to is actually something which is nothing to do with what happens on the pitch at all. In my ratings in later years, there was no bigger weight given to anything than I would give to the wage bill. The wage bill of a club, I came to realise, told me what results the owners were entitled to expect. You know, we're paying this amount of money, we're entitled to expect these sort of results. And that was the level to which all teams would return over time. You know, for Manchester City or Manchester United or Chelsea, it's this sort of level. For Crystal Palace, it's this different sort of level. But every team has their level, which is determined by their wage bill. And that is the point to which they should return over time. Now, in the immediate past, they might have been doing something else. And if so, you would expect in the next few games something in between to happen. But eventually, all teams were heading back to their wage bill. Yeah.
Okay, now you created ratings for teams at home and abroad. How many factors would go into creating the ratings, and did you have to watch all the matches before updating?
Um, I didn't have to watch the matches in terms of finding stuff to update the ratings. The ratings themselves were taking into account as many factors as I could put into them, as many as possible. I came to believe over the years that the truth in anything is not something you just find in one place, but it's scattered all over the place. You know, there's a bit of it here and there's a bit of it there, and there's another bit somewhere else. And if you're trying to get at the truth, you want to gather as many of these bits as you can and put them all together. So I would have lots of different factors in my rating. I mean, if you want, I don't know how technical you want me to get. I can get into talking about how I decided what they should be, sort of thing. But there was lots of different stuff, all different sort of indicators of performance, telling you all sorts of different things that will go into the ratings, and then they'd all be sort of mixed together. You know.
Okay, we won't go into too much detail there because I've got a lot of questions.
Okay. Yeah,
the next question is, you created models for a range of markets, including corners and cards. Obviously, we're moving on a bit from where we were talking about. Now, we hear a lot about modelling. I hear a lot about modelling from betting people. Can you put into layman's terms how you go about creating a model?
I can tell you how I did it. I'm not sure.
Well, that's what we want to know how you did it. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. If it's the way that everybody else would do it. I would start by trying to find out what happens in this sort of market and how it's sort of how everything is sort of connected to everything else. So I would plough back through sort of lots of data. So, for example, you know, if we're talking about a model on corners, I would plough through loads and loads of data from loads and loads of seasons and loads of competitions, and separate it all out. So I had different types of matches, you know, in which there were a range of possibilities. You know, start off with where teams are fairly close together, and then this one's a bit better than the other one, and a bit more and a bit more and a bit more. As you gradually increase the sort of superiority of one team over another, what effect does that have on any other markers? In particular, what does it have on corners, if that's what I'm looking at now? So in this sort of game, how do the corners tend to be split between the teams, and how many of them do you tend to get? And then I would try to come up with equations that sort of set that out as well as I could. And that would be the model into which I would put my ratings. And when I was doing my ratings, that they would be trying to filter out all the randomness as well. They'd be taking into account how well I expected the team to do in terms of actually winning the match, and how well I would expect them to do in terms of performing in this market. And that would take into account not only their history, but much more, very often, just what sort of team that they were, you know. So I don't know whether that... Yeah, I feel myself that wasn't a very coherent answer. I don't know.
Is tapping in data something that you do more than watching football?
Yes. You know, sometimes when I meet people, they ask what I do, and I tell them, and often they just look at me blankly, but sometimes they might say, oh, that sounds very interesting, very glamorous. It isn't most of the time. I've spent, I don't know how many days, in how many years, just tapping in numbers, because I had to get all that stuff myself before I could start. And it was always by far and away the biggest part of the job, just getting the numbers so that you could begin. You know, in the beginning, I was a freelancer, so if I wanted to offer stats, I had to get them myself. And even when I went to work on papers, they were at that time primarily sort of racing focused papers, and they didn't really have football stats, or at least not anything as we were moving on beyond the results and that sort of thing. So I had to gather it all myself. I should add that after a few years on the Racing Post, that they started to help me in that way, and they were able to begin to gather a lot of the data themselves, and so that saved me an enormous amount of time. But still, I was spending a lot of it myself. There were. I used to employ my wife one day a week. She would be just typing in data for me. So much of it was just getting to the point where you could begin, you know.
No, I asked somebody very well respected in the industry about those sort of markets, corners, throw-ins, that sort of thing. And he said to me, he told me that these markets are priced up using algorithms and that very little human input. And you were beating them. So what was your magic ingredient?
I don't know. I suppose it must have been that my algorithms were a little bit better than what everybody else was using. And I also felt myself, I mean, I know, and I take your point that a lot of these things initially were sort of generated by algorithms with the bookmakers. But I always felt myself that sometimes either the algorithms themselves or the people taking the outputs from the algorithms were moving them a little bit in a certain way, which made perfect sense for the bookmakers. Because very often what I felt myself was that when I saw an area where there might be an edge, what was it? It was, it seemed to me that the bookmakers had moved the line a little bit too far in the direction where they just knew from experience almost everybody else was going to be betting. You know, in football, on a totals market, you know, if you're betting over and under goals, corners, bookings, fouls, whatever, almost everybody bets over. In a handicap market, even though the teams are supposed to be sort of arranged so they're more or less even at this level, still almost everybody backs the team who are favourite in the out market. And most of my tips would be the other way. I'd be backing on the handicap the team who were outsiders in the outright market, or I'd be backing unders for anything. And I always got the impression that bookmakers were trying to position themselves so that, if I can put it this way, they were offering the worst price that they could without reducing the amount of money that they would take in, you know, and they should do because you know they're a business and that's a job, that's their job, that's what they should be doing. And I actually felt the bookmakers were trying to do their jobs as well as they could, but just sometimes they were maybe going a little bit too far and then leaving a little bit of an edge on the other side, which is where I or somebody else who knew about these things might come in. And that was the impression that I formed, you know.
Now, you tipped spread, traditional and specialist bets. Have any or all of them become harder to beat over the years? Do you think the bookmakers are getting better, or you don't think they're harder to beat?
All of them have become harder, much harder than when I began.
Are their computers getting better? Is that what it is?
Well, the computers are getting better, yeah. In the early days, particularly on things like the spreads, it wasn't done with computers at all. But yeah, in my experience, my opinion is that all of these markets have become harder and harder to beat over the years. I found it progressively more difficult. I never wanted to put up a tip unless I felt there was an edge. And there were fewer and fewer times over the years when I felt there was an edge. And yeah, the markets are just so much better and so much more sophisticated than they used to be, you know. If I can just round off by saying, you know, when I look back now and I think about some of the ways that I used to price up things on the spread, I realised they were all very crude and some of them were actually just wrong. But it must have been that at the time they weren't as much wrong as what the firms themselves were doing. But that's how it was, you know.